All right, I think we're on air. Welcome everyone to the latest CMX AMA. We're here with basically a personal hero of mine. He is the author of The Art of Community. So, he literally wrote a book on community. He's worked at a number of companies, including Canonical and Github, which are, needless to say, pretty major players. And he's speaking at CMX Summit on November 2nd. So really excited to have Jono Bacon here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
So we've got some questions from our audience. If anyone who is tuning in has questions, please tweet us at CMX. Let us know what you'd like me to ask Jono. And I will let folks know that we are going to release a discount code later in this AMA for CMX Summit West 2016. So stay tuned for that. But first, I want to start with the hard-hitting questions. I had to decide between a bacon joke and a British joke. I'm going to say, do you think your British accent makes it easier or harder to build communities?
That's a good question. I think not just being British, but just being kind of foreign in the US has the distinctive benefit. If you talk a bit funny, then it means that it's an easier icebreaker. You know, the amount of times I've been to conferences, I've been to meetings, I've been various places, been into bars, and someone's just, so where are you from? Or, often, which part of Australia are you from? So I think it definitely makes it easier as an icebreaker. I'm not sure if it makes that much of a difference in building communities. One thing I think is, each country has got like its own distinctive culture. And so I'm not so much sure whether it's so much my accent, but certainly my background. I grew up, in the open source community, and there was just such a distinctive English kind of vibe to joining Linux user groups in the UK, and we did LugRadio and various other bits and pieces. So I think just certain countries are just kind of a little bit more aligned with community than others, and I would count England in that sense. And one other country in particular is Brazil. Brazilians are nuts about community, so it was good.
So let's talk a little bit more about your background. Just briefly, I've given some background, but tell me your life story.
Wow. Okay, I'll keep this quick because no one wants to really listen to this. So I was obviously born in England. I discovered community, or the concept of community, in 1998 when my older brother came home for a few weeks, and I was complaining about Windows, and he said, "Oh, you should put Linux on your machine." I'd never heard of it. And I bought a book. I used to work in a bookstore, and I got this book with a CD on the back. And the first chapter talked about all of these people all over the world working together to build things, to build this operating system. And I was just immediately captivated by it. Like, there was just, there's this kind of cliche of, oh, a light bulb went off in my mind, but it really did. Like, from that moment onwards, I was just fascinated with it. And for me at the time, it was, as a 18 or 19-year-old, dork in the middle of England, I didn't feel connected into anything. There was no mission that I was a part of. There was no wider effort that was beyond me. It was just me and my immediate vicinity. And all I'd heard for my entire life was people moaning about how communities aren't what they used to be. No one talks to their neighbors, blah, 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 blah. And then I discovered there's this whole online community, and they're not just kind of hanging out with each other, which I was familiar with, but they're actually building something, they're making something, and everybody can play a role in that, even this 18 to 19-year-old long-haired nerd in England. So from that moment onwards, I was captivated. And the thing that for me, it opened up like just this spirit of just learning more and trying to kind of play a role and contribute in some way. So I built a website called Linux UK, for UK Linux users, which was ironically made in Microsoft front page. No one knew. And then I went to work for an organization called OpenAdvantage. Basically, when I was at university, I wrote magazine articles for the computer press on the side to earn some money. And I wrote, when everybody was scrambling for a job at the end of university, I just decided, you know what, I'll just write more articles. I don't really want a job. And ended up writing an article about this organization that had basically raised £4.5 million to help the local community learn open source. because kind of like areas of the US, lots of jobs were going overseas, manual labor jobs were going overseas. So a lot of people were out of work. And that was just a trial by fire. We had like 40 or 50 companies that we had to move over within this region to open source. So I really cut my teeth on community and consulting there. But that was a temporary funded project. So I basically then looked around for something next and went to work at Canonical, and spent like the lion's share of my formative years there. Like I was there for nearly 8 years. And that was just a remarkable experience where, again, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was surrounded by people who had different puzzle pieces of the solution. And it was such a, I'm of the viewpoint that the way in which you get better at something is to embroil yourselves around people who are really good at that thing. And Canonical was precisely that. So spent some time there, wrote the book, kicked off the Community Leadership Summit, which is an annual conference, did some other bits and pieces, and then decided I wanted to get out of technology for a bit. I was ready for something new, went to XPRIZE, and then I was there for a bit and thought, you know what, I'd like to come back to technology. XPRIZE was great, but it was just, it's hard to build communities in a fundamentally competitive environment. And the other thing about XPRIZE is that it's an organization that is kind of much higher level. It's much more about like the prize statement. You don't really get down into the nitty gritty of how you build things. So I was ready to kind of get back to the nitty gritty, and then went on to work at GitHub, spent some time at GitHub, and then decided, you know what, it was time to kind of do my own thing. So now I'm consulting.
Great. Yeah, if you need a community strategist, talk to Jono.
Try.
So our first community question comes from Alessio Federini, and he asked a bunch of questions, but the crux of it was about your time at Canonical. Okay. And he says he's really interested in product-based communities, and he was wondering sort of how you interacted with product managers and testing teams, and just sort of how you fit into the organization with this community aspect.
That's a really great question, because I think this is one of the most challenging aspects of building communities for a company, is that fundamentally it's cross-functional. But most companies don't necessarily realize that. I think that's changing now. So when I was at Canonical, for example, the first year that I was there, I worked for Mark Shuttleworth, who's the founder, because he liked new roles to work under him for a bit. And then I went and worked in the engineering team, which made a lot more sense in many ways, because it's a fundamentally engineering-centric organization. Some people get to work in marketing organizations, and there's a lot of kind of opinion about this. My view is it doesn't really matter where you report into. What matters is that you can be successful in that organization and that you have the remit to be successful. Because fundamentally, if you want to build a community, it's about working with product management and engineering and marketing and outreach and the sales and business teams. And the way I kind of approached this was to try and take a position of, look, everybody brings value, but that value is often misunderstood between different groups. So, for example, you often hear like the different tribes complaining about each other. Engineers moaning about, the marketing team, and marketing team moaning about engineers is the classic example. To me, there was value on both sides, and my goal was to kind of be a translation layer to help move towards a vision, but then to bring people in so they felt like they were moving their needle, but they were also collaborating in something that was going to help the company. I think that doing effective community management is a really political position, and you have to be able to see the benefits and the strengths in everybody and the risks in people, and be able to navigate solutions that pull into those benefits and strengths. And I think it's different for every company. It's not the same. In every company I've ever worked with, it's radically different. I mean, just the marketing teams vary tremendously in different companies. So, I sometimes hear about people say, I will never go and do community management as part of the marketing team. I'll never report into marketing, which is a really short-sighted view. There are some terrible marketing teams, but there's some great marketing teams. So, but the only thing I'd finally say in that is, I think a big chunk of this is about building relationships with those different teams. The old joke of, the business is done in the bar. I think that a lot of that's true. It's not necessarily the bar, but it's go and have lunch with people, go and have coffee with people, build those relationships, because that's how you get things done. But then the other thing is having a strategy that people can buy into, and then pulling off really manageable pieces, and then being able to help these people to work together on them.
actually reminds me of when I went to one of the first Community Leadership Summit West sessions. It's an unconference, and so I said, I'm going to do a session on introverts. Probably most of you aren't. And so many people showed up, and I had no idea how many community people were introverts. And what I realized is that translation aspect that you talk about, that's because whether you're an introvert or not, community managers tend to be good at taking a step back and observing and figuring out what's actually happening here, and then translating that. Whereas let's just say like marketers, for example, are really good at getting out there and being proactive, and that can be really great with marketing and sometimes not as good with interpersonal stuff. So
it's tough because every community is so different. I mean, even if you compare two similar areas, like two open source projects, two technology projects, whatever they might be, the community is radically different. The company is radically different. So therefore, the approaches have to be different. There's just no. This was one of the things I found really difficult when I wrote my book. Was there just is no standard blueprint for this. There are methods. I believe there are maturity frameworks for it, but even those have to be custom designed for each organization. So it's always a good time.
So put you on the spot here. What are two things that you think all successful communities have?
The way I look at it is there's a fluffy answer and then there's a more focused answer. I think the ultimate goal of a community is to build a sense of belonging in people. When you get somebody to feel like they belong somewhere, that they're part of something, you get retention. And every community, basically what you want from people is productivity and retention. You want people who stick around. People who join for 3 or 4 days, it takes time to spin people up, and it's not as useful. So the mantra that I've always had is the way in which we build belonging is that we need to encourage significant and sustained contributions. And both of those are important. Sustained will build that retention. It will build those longer term relationships. It will give an opportunity for those relationships to gestate. But you want people doing big things. You want people contributing in significant ways. That's not to say that you don't allow people to do little things. Of course you do. But I think when we're architecting our community, we want to shoot for significant, sustained contributions. So I think belonging is the first outcome, but that's of course very fluffy. The second thing, which I think is important, is effective community has to be an end-to-end story. I run the Community Leadership Summit every year, so we have like a couple hundred people who, from all walks of life, community managers, show up. And one of the things I've noticed is a lot of community managers focus on a very narrow part of the game, which is blogging, social media, events. And so primarily the evangelist kind of things. And that's really important. And there's tremendous work and very talented people who do that. But to me, community is much more. It's the minute somebody learns about what you're doing to the point when they are a regular kind of staple in the community. There's a whole set of pieces that exist there. There's on-ramps, there's incentives, intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. There's all of these different components. So I believe that building belonging is the ultimate kind of goal, even intangible as it may be. But the way in which we do that is by building a comprehensive journey for people. So I think a success criteria here for me is how expansive is your strategy. If your strategy is very just, oh yeah, we're going to build a blog, we're going to do social media, we're going to run some meetups, that's really cool, but just accept the fact that your strategy is narrow. And for some companies, that's fine. Like that's all you want to do, that's all you want to invest in. But to me, it's very difficult to build belonging with those narrower pieces, because fundamentally events, social media, and blogging is a consumptive they're consumptive platforms. You go to a meetup to join it, you go to a blog to read it, you go to social media to read it, and you might share it. But in terms of active participation, you want that kind of wider journey. So I'd look at comprehensiveness and belonging, I think would be my two answers.
Yeah, I love that. And I think a lot of our speakers at CMX Summit are really kind of harping on that point of you can take these things to the next level. It's great to bring people in a room and connect them. You can do more than that. You can get them involved, and you can scale your business in ways you probably could have never imagined if you actually, bring people on as partners.
Right, exactly.
Well, just for anyone who's tuning in now, I'm speaking with Jono Bacon. He is a community strategy consultant an epic veteran of the community industry, and he is speaking at CMX Summit West this year. And as promised, I want to give out that discount code. The next 6 people who use the code JONO, so that's JONO, will get 15% off their ticket to CMX Summit West. Those are going to go real quick, so use the code JONO, go grab it. And I think we have a live question from our audience, so let's switch over to that. Dennis Shao says, what are minimum community management requirements for a developer community? Is coding experience required? Great question.
That's a great question. I think for a developer, it depends on how expansive I think you want your community to be. There are some developer communities that are very much focused on specifically development, and then there are some which encourage other types of contribution that relate to building software or hardware, such as translations, documentation, advocacy, QA, things like that. So I'd first of all decide, do you want to encourage lots of those different roles? And it's easy to say, yeah, we want everybody. But bear in mind that there's a lot of work in trying to build a good experience for each of those different roles. So think about how much time you've got. In terms of the requirements for developers specifically, I think what you want to really look for, in my mind, is you definitely want people who can contribute to that code base, to contribute to that community. So you want people who can build code. You want people who not just can write code, but understand the software development lifecycle. There's a lot of programmers out there who can write great code, but they don't really know how to collaborate with other people. And we often think in the open source world that this is so obvious, code review and using GitHub and GitLab and whatever else. Whereas for a lot of people, it's really kind of a bit weird. So I ideally look for people who are good developers who also have been through the code review process. So they're familiar with submitting a pull request and it being reviewed and how that gets dealt with. Because that code review process is there's a lot of psychology behind that. There's a lot of behavioral economics that are driving how people behave in that situation. So for example, it's well known that, status is a key driving factor in how we build communities. Like, people care about when they switch between different levels of status. So arguably in developed communities, people really want to be committers. So you want to have a path to being a committer. And you want to make sure that the people who join that path have got the skills where they could ultimately get to that point. But also there is another principle called the IKEA effect, which Dan Ariely often talks about, which is we have more value in the things that we make. So if I was to make something and everyone was to make exactly the same thing, I would just intrinsically think that my thing was better and had more value, just because that's how humans think. And particularly egotistical humans think that even more, obviously. So that offers implications for when you go through that code review process, because if you submit something, you may think it's more valuable than it actually is. So I think looking for people who have like the right kind of temperament, which is obviously a hot word in American politics right now, but also the technical experience of contributing, but people who are also, they'd be open and willing to play in that, that participate in the code review process. Some companies, and I think it's changing now, but some companies really focus on, like, they identify specific code reviewers and then they expect everybody else to do the development, and it doesn't scale, and it doesn't scale in open source projects as well. You want to build an environment where everyone is a code reviewer, and that's part of being a great developer, is not just writing great code, it's reading other people's code and providing input in it. So I'd look at that holistic life cycle piece. Don't just look for someone who just wants to throw code over the wall, because they might be good and you can mentor them, but then mentoring them is, of course, it takes time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Our next question, we're running out of time here, but I want to try to get to these. Nancy Sabold asks, I'd be interested in strategies or war stories about moving established community to a different platform. How many people do you lose? How painful is it? Do you run the risk of killing the community? Is that something you want to get into, or is that too much of a painful memory?
No, it is difficult. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think not just with communities, change is just weird for people in general. I'm particularly averse to change in many cases. I mean, probably the easiest thing I've ever done was actually moving to America, which is weird because as a kid, I would never have imagined I'd ever actually do that. But people don't like change. People don't like moving. They don't like switching jobs. But again, talking about behavioral economics, like there is one of the things that's been scientifically proven again and again is that humans are unbelievably adaptable. But we're adaptable, but uncertainty is something that we don't like. And if we can reduce uncertainty and we can capitalize on that adaptive framework of how we think, then we can make that change easier. So the way I think that maps into practicalities is, imagine you want to move from meetup.com to another platform for organizing events, as an example, or you want to move from GitHub to GitLab or something like that. I think the first thing is having a conversation with the people who are in charge of the community, the people who are not just technically in charge, but the people who are the real movers and shakers. You'll just know who those people are, and reach out to them and have a conversation, make them feel part of the discussion. And then once you feel like they're on board, you can then broaden those rings of that tree outwards until you get to a point where you can start publicly saying, okay, we're planning this, and we're going to be super open and transparent about it. So you can talk about the benefits, but then also really talk about the disadvantages. And one of the things I always think is important is to just say to people, look, it's going to suck for a while. It really is, but it will be better. It will be better eventually. So I think the change is painful. It's slow. Like if you think it's going to take a month, it'll take 3 months to ultimately make it. But the solution to it, I think, is making your community feel part of that transition and be radically transparent. And then at that point, you convert your critics into people who say, well, they're obviously trying to move us in the right direction. And then people have more empathy for the change.
Well, that seems like a great lesson in general for building community and probably a good place to wrap things up. Jono, tell us really briefly about what you're going to be speaking about at CMX Summit and where people can find you online.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to be talking at CMX Summit. I love the work that CMX does. Big fan of Evan and David and Carrie and the rest of the team. So really excited to be joining. I've only actually ever been to one of the events as a visitor because I've been booked to the other events. My plan is, I'm still kind of finalizing exactly what I want to talk about, but my plan is to basically is to talk about I mentioned earlier on about building this end-to-end process of how you build a community, not just the narrow piece, is talking about that and talking about those underlying psychological components that feed into that. And then also just how we can capitalize on some of the most fundamental elements of what drives behavior, things such as incentives and rewards and things such as how people mature in different ways and the different factors that play into that. So essentially, I'm going to be presenting some overarching kind of an overarching framework of how this works, but with some very specific, like, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, so you can actually apply it. So it's not just a bunch of hand-wavy nonsense, as so many presentations are. And then if you want to find me, you can go to my website, jonobacon.org, or you can follow me on Twitter, Jono Bacon, pretty much everywhere, apart from Instagram, because there's some other horrible human being has got my name, apparently. So
they post a lot of bacon pictures?
Yeah, sadly not, but Instagram, I don't need your Instagram.
Great. Well, you can catch Jono online. You can also catch him, as mentioned, speaking at CMX Summit West, which is coming up on November 1st and 2nd in San Francisco. And if it has not been already snatched up, there is a promo code, Jono, Jono, which will give you 15% off your ticket. That's good for 6 people. I don't know how many are left, so go for it now.
Yeah.
And Jono, thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure.
No, thank you so much. Keep up the great work.
You too. Take care.